Hi, welcome to the Cinematography Salon Podcast, a show about celebrating cinematography and inspiring both the current and next generation of visual artists, exploring the latest trends, techniques, technologies, and culture, and featuring exclusive interviews with some of the most talented and innovative cinematographers working today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Pascucci, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Ava Benjamin Shore. We are recording in person at Harbor Picture Company in Manhattan. And we wanted to extend a huge thank you to Harbor for hosting us and helping support our efforts. Today marks an extremely special milestone in our show's history as we interview a figure who is not just a remarkably talented and an iconic cinematographer, but someone who can easily be described as a legend in our industry. Our guest is the recipient of the esteemed Lifetime Achievement Award from the ASC and has collaborated with some of the most revered directors and auteurs, including David Lynch, Ang Lee, Charlie Kaufman, Jim Jarmusch, and Todd Solondz, among many others. He is a visionary and has been described as having an extraordinary emotional approach to cinematography and a unique method of approaching his movies from the inside out. We are beyond thrilled to welcome Frederick Elmes, ASC, to the Cinematography Salon. Fred, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. Good to join you.
This interview coincides with something very special going on, which is that the Metrograph Theater in Manhattan's Lower East Side is showcasing a retrospective of 6 of your selected works. They'll be screening from Saturday, April 13th for 2 weeks, concluding on Saturday, April 27th. The films we'll discuss today, which will also be featured at the screenings, are Wild at Heart by David Lynch, The Namesake by Mira Nair, The Ice Storm by Ang Lee, River's Edge by Tim Hunter, Blue Velvet by David Lynch, and Night on Earth by Jim Jarmusch. On a personal note, watching these films has honestly left a pretty profound impression on me. I was completely enthralled by the portrayal of human experience in The Namesake, directed by Mira Nair, and the scope of that shoot and the different countries and adventures that you went on to capture that, and was just really captivated by it. And it got me thinking about something that felt very unique and powerful throughout all of these films, and I felt it was pretty consistent and definitely struck me, was this sort of portrayal of this gritty human quality, and it just feels very authentic and visceral. I would love to just hear you elaborate on the importance of listening and how you approach movies from the inside out.
For me, making a film is about collaborating with the director. It's about drawing out the director's ideas and joining them in that world and helping to create it. So really, we do create different worlds for each film, and that's the nature of filmmaking. We create a space that's a believable place for the actors to go through their scenes, their moments, their dramatic situations. And that for me is the most wonderful thing, is to create this world, to create this place where this new thing can happen. If you look at Mira's film, The Namesake, we created a world that included the underside of New York City as well as Calcutta, India. And to bring those two into kind of juxtaposition was really a fun adventure, and a very different one than creating the world where a David Lynch film happens.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's some questions I have specifically about The Namesake and your approach to that. I think on a sort of a larger scale, I did want to just look at the entire scope of your career and your filmography too. Like I had heard your name so many times, but I think when I first went to your Letterboxd or IMDb page, I don't think I truly realized how many films I liked you had shot. Not only that, but like that series, The Night Of, that was such an incredible series. And I remember thinking at the time, this is incredible. It's beautiful. It's stuck in my mind as one of my favorite like TV shows. And then I saw your name on it and I was like, of course. So, I mean, it's been really cool, like Peter said, to explore your films. And I guess in terms of your entire filmography, I had a few questions about it in totality. There's definitely a sense I get that you are interested in smaller scale studio films, independent filmmakers with a interesting perspective. And I guess I was curious, did you ever have a desire to move from that area into larger, bigger budget things, more long term? Because I know you dabbled, you did like The Hulk. I know Ang Lee had like a Western that seemed like it was a bigger budget. But did you ever feel pigeonholed in smaller studio or independent films?
You know, I think the film projects that appeal to me most are the ones that are movies I'd like to go see. They're films that interested me. When I hear about the story, I got the sense, oh yeah, that would be cool to go see that film. I would like to to experience it. So being part of the making of it is really part of that process for me. I think you can make a fabulous, very large budget film and a fabulous, very small budget film. I think that the budget imposes constraints, but part of what we do is live with them, and work with them and make the most out of, what you're given to make the movie. It's a real gift to be able to make a movie. Not everybody gets to do this, and we get to play on a pretty big scale. Even a small movie, you're taking 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks to let this story unfold, to create this new space, this, a new city or a new planet or a new whatever, where these characters can exist and live, and we're entertaining audiences here by telling these stories. So that's the gift of it, and I think that I've really chosen carefully to find directors who have unique ideas, unique visions, and stories that really move me.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I think that made me think of so many things personally, the joy of shooting a film. Like, there is a reason why you go move mountains and leave time with your loved ones to go make films, because there is something so rewarding and special about it. And even if it's like just a few $1 million film, or you don't have a lot of resources, like, there's almost nothing more enjoyable than that.
No, it's a fabulous opportunity, and we're lucky to be able to do it. I mean, I think the budget's always part of the package. The number of days you shoot is always part of the deal. But really more important are the personalities of the people involved and the ideas that they come to the table with. Budget is just a part of it. With Eraserhead, we used to say, people would ask, what was the budget on Eraserhead? And we would always say, well, it's under $1 million, but the fact is it was under 200,000, I think. It was a pretty inexpensive film that was shot by just a handful of people over a long period of time. That's what we had going for us, was the time.
Yeah, I did find a interview that you were kind of in with David Lynch, where it was like you guys were in some sort of, it was a location, and I don't know how to describe the location except some sort of like derelict industrial space. Correct. And there was some.
Yes, no, that's where
we
spend
the interview
a lot
I'm
of time.
talking
yes.
about?
We like those spaces, David and I. So we had fun, and that was a very odd interview indeed.
Yeah. Did you find that, like, I have this feeling that, or kind of this idea that like-minded people are drawn to each other in the film industry. Like, there is this question of, how did you of all people end up with David Lynch? Like, it's just such a funny thing that he became such a phenomenon, because I'm sure at some point you guys were just two kind of like guys just into the same thing.
David Lynch is a filmmaker that I met at the American Film Institute. We were both there at the same time, and David had started this film Eraserhead with Herb Cardwell, who was the first cinematographer, and Herb could only work on it for a limited period of time, and it became clear that David's 30 or 40-minute film was going to become a much bigger movie. So Herb had to leave. The AFI introduced me to David and put us together, and we just had a great first conversation where he showed me some of the footage they've shot and told me about the story and asked if I wanted to be involved. And I just couldn't wait to get started.
There's something I was kind of wondering about that collaboration. Like, personally for me, I find that when I am working with someone, they can open up my mind to like look and see things in a new way. And I was wondering, David is so idiosyncratic, and just even hearing him speak in video interviews is inspiring, and I feel like it opens up the world in such a special way. And like, you've worked with him many times over the years, and did he change the way you look at things? And like, if so, like how?
I think it's true that every movie changes me. Every movie I do changes me in some way, because working with that director on such an intimate basis allows me to see things their way, to see things a little bit through their eyes, or to help them see it more clearly. And it gets so very specific about how close or far away you are from something in their mind, and what the mood of the room is in their mind, what it's going to take to evoke the emotions that they need to feel right now. I mean, that's what is such a wonderful, and I'm so curious about it. I'm curious about getting to know a director on the basis of all those intimate little things that create emotional moments and movement in a story. And everybody does it differently. I mean, that's kind of the wonderful thing. If you look at the way Mira works with actors or the way David works with actors, they're different. You know, the mood and the feeling of their settings is different. They're all based in some reality, but I mean, David's reality is real different than Mira's reality. You know, and oddly, when I was working on Eraserhead at the AFI, I was in this cloistered educational experience environment, and it was wonderful. That's why I went there. But at the same moment, I met John Cassavetes, and I'd always been a fan of John's, and I'd seen his movies, and I knew what he was doing. And sure enough, there he was in Los Angeles about to make a movie and asked me to be part of it. I had to apologize to David Lynch and say, well, I've just got to take a break and get a paying job for a few minutes here. And, worked on John Cassavetes' film, which was great because here, an established but very independent, free-spirited director who's bucking the Hollywood trends, even though he's an insider and a known actor, but making his own movies his own way, very independently, very shoestring budget-wise. And in a way, we were doing the same thing on David's film. I mean, I don't think I knew it quite yet because we were just hoping that Eraserhead would be finished, really. But it was a shoestring and there were just a few people and we were all there because of David.
Yeah. I feel like this is opening up so many new questions for me. Like, which John Cassavetes films did you work on? I read about this, but I don't think I actually know which films you worked on.
I worked on The Killing of a Chinese Bookie and Opening Night. So those were two films that we shot in the mid-'70s in Los Angeles. And I had met John at a screening of Husbands, actually, in New York at NYU when I was a student there. So I met him, and I was actually the projectionist on the movie that day. Then I met him again in Los Angeles. I worked very briefly on Woman Under the Influence, which was also quite a wonderful film. But I was, a camera assistant at that point.
That's so interesting to hear about John Cassavetes. That's great.
But the wonderful part for me was to see this balance between these two filmmakers. Even though I didn't get it at the time, I was a graduate film student. I could do anything. I was into making this all happen for myself and use it all as a learning experience.
Yeah, you have someone who's like kind of formal and then someone who is rough around the edges in terms of like, I guess, composition.
Well, in really all ways, they're kind of opposites.
Yeah. 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 Were you intimidated working with John Cassavetes early on? Because you must have been at the very beginning of your career.
It was very early on. No, I wasn't. I don't know. I was pretty headstrong at that point, I think. I don't know why. Because, yeah, he's an intimidating filmmaker. He was a very powerful individual. He was very charismatic, always on, always there, but very, very kind and very willing to listen to young people and their point of view. Very, I would say, compelled to draw young filmmakers in and see what they had to say and to make them part of his process. Here on Killing of a Chinese Bookie, there's a whole series of pretty seasoned professional actors who've done this for a long time. Yet with John, he tried to pull other people in to get, to get a different look, to get a different point of view of the making of a movie, to hire me, who knew something about camera and lighting, but not a lot, and see how I could help make his movie better. He certainly didn't want it to be a Hollywood movie. He didn't want it to look glossy and finely finished. That really put him off. He was into the grittiness and the reality, particularly on Chinese Bookie, of Sunset Boulevard.
Hearing that reminds me of, I heard you talk about in a speech sort of learning from John Cassavetes that less than perfect is all right. And I think that might sound simple, but I think for a cinematographer, that's a very complicated thing to wrap one's head around. So I'd just love to hear you elaborate a little bit on that philosophy and maybe how it's carried into other projects after kind of learning that. And if there's a way to sort of break that down in your own words for people who maybe are very wrapped up in perfection and trying to achieve the best technical image, I guess.
Working with John was difficult for me because it did mean giving up so much. It meant giving up this compulsion, this need for perfection in what I did. And for whatever reason, as a student, I was just compelled to get it right, whatever that meant to me at that point. And I would say it was fun doing it. And certainly in the thick of making Eraserhead, we strove to get it right. We strove for this degree of perfection, that we felt we needed in the storytelling. And John was the opposite. I mean, John just threw that out the window right away. Anything that looked at all like a backlight on some actor's head just turned him off. And, he had such a problem with anything that seemed glossy. I remember doing a scene once where Ben Gazzara had to run across this empty bar and chase somebody out the door. And I said, okay, John, this is a little tough because he's moving really fast and I'm going to do my best to keep up with him. And this was the days of a very big camera, a BNC R Mitchell camera. So it comes on a gear head, and I'd never actually used a gear head before. So this was a new experience as well. But I finally got a couple of takes where the camera was keeping up with him, and it looked pretty good to me. And John said, I think we just need one more. And I said, well, I think that's about as good as it's going to get, given what I know here. And John said, no, let's just do another one. And as Ben was running across the room and I was panning like a madman, John walked past me and just elbowed me so that the camera goes kaboom. And this little bump in the pan was what John was looking for. It was like a little roughness that I had managed to iron out of the scene, and he put it back in.
Oh my gosh.
So, I mean,
so cool.
But that's the difference between simultaneously doing a film with David Lynch and doing a film with John Cassavetes. They were both brilliant filmmakers, and their films are so wonderful, with or without me. But I was so lucky to be in that situation where I got to participate with both of them.
Yeah. And I think this is an interesting topic for me, because I think Peter and I, we've talked about this a lot, and I think Greg Fraser covered this a little bit too, but embracing imperfection. And I'm curious, like, for someone like you who definitely has the ability to navigate different aesthetic choices,
Sometimes.
but generally they seem to... Okay. Well, it sounds like, I mean, given your filmography, I'm going to say it's evident. I would say, like, what does the commercial side of your career look like? And in spaces where at least it seems like there's like a emphasis on maximal beauty, like, what does that look like and what does that feel like to you to go into those spaces?
What's beauty? I'm not understanding.
Yeah.
What is...
I agree.
We have so many tools at our fingertips these days. And even when I started out, there were wonderful tools available to us. I mean, celluloid film is a wonderful medium. And I grew up taking still pictures and trying to learn how to use color and black and white film and develop it in a certain way and to light it in a certain way to create some sense of place and mood. A still photograph, that's one of the things that I learned a bit more about in Rochester when I was at school. And to take that knowledge and bring it to film was really fun. It was really very cool because a lot of those same things you do in stills, you can do in film, whether it's the stock or the developing or the lighting, you can take advantage of them. And that's what you do. But I think that it really has to be in service of something else. I mean, if you were a photojournalist and taking a series of pictures to explain something about this character or to tell a story about this family, you'd do it in a certain way. You'd approach it in a certain way visually. And that's kind of what we do on a bigger scale, making a movie. I mean, I think that part of my roots doing documentary films helped me with that. It helped me with walking into a room and seeing what's available and finding a way to use it to make this moment work. Mm-hmm. Kind of, it's like working with, a Polaroid. It's working with something that's instantaneous that you just have to get it right now because it won't be right an hour from now. The moment won't be there. So documentaries helped me in that way. Working on films where you're forced to handhold the camera brings this whole other level of composition and and hence movement and storytelling to the drama. So all those things contribute. You get to choose which ones to use.
It's interesting because I think I totally hear what Ava's saying, and I'm curious myself because it's sort of like you're watching your work, as she said, it's so technically brilliant, and yet it really does feel completely in service of the story. There is no moments where the cinematography feels distracting or feels in any way like it's something you're trying to project onto the project. And I think that when I think about how to translate that to a commercial, I'm curious about that as well. Like, obviously there's the idea that some commercials are more narrative driven, so they lend themselves to that kind of skill and that kind of craft. But then there's the other side where maybe a commercial is just purely aesthetic and purely gloss and everything. So when you do shoot commercials, are you being selective and choosing ones that have that narrative quality that is a part of your craft? Or are you able to just lean into the aesthetic of a commercial and kind of shoot it in a very glossy sort of way that is aesthetically pleasing and just for the experience of using the tools and gaining that experience and things like that?
When you say commercial, you mean a commercial film, a bigger commercial film, or actually a commercial?
I meant commercial.
Commercial,
yeah. Like a brand, like a Haagen-Dazs.
I haven't done Haagen-Dazs. I've done a lot of other things. But so, yeah, I think I'm fortunate that I've been able to work in the realm of shooting commercials as well as dramatic narrative stories. Not everybody gets to do that, but there's some wonderful things that happen when you do both because they share and they inform each other. Obviously, the format of a 90-minute film is different and you're approaching everything differently. However, the tools are all the same. The lights are the same. And really the intent is the same because many commercials are structured around telling a short story in 30 seconds or a minute really explicitly. And even though on paper many of the shots and or words have been worked out way, way ahead of time, there's room to move, usually. There's room to make it better, to try a different version, to try something new and fresh. And again, it becomes my relationship with the director and just what the director wants to do with it. Certainly there are constraints and there's a lot of grown-ups watching what you're doing, and you must honor that. It is about commerce, making a commercial. But in reality, the process of telling this little story is pretty cool, whether it's a big one or a little one. And the best commercials that I've done come from the germ of someone's wonderful idea, and it starts on paper, and then the director fleshes it out and makes it happen. And together we create some sort of world that you believe for a moment. Even though it's short, you have to believe it. And those are the ones that you remember. I mean, those are the ones that make a difference. So yeah, I've had a great deal of fun, and I've learned a great deal from commercials and commercial directors.
I think that's beautifully said.
And occasionally I've had the opportunity to work with a narrative feature director on commercials, and that's kind of the best of both because you get to tell a shorter story in a really exquisite, condensed way with a director that you have this ongoing relationship with.
I guess I am interested in the way that you prep a project. And I do want to hear about what your process is in like analyzing a script, cultivating a language for a film. Is there any crossover from that into, say, like a branded commercial?
Sure. I mean, I think that these mediums share everything, share the process. It's just that it's much bigger on a film. On a narrative film, you have more time. A commercial is a few days or a couple of weeks, maybe a little more. But a feature is months and months of preparation before you start shooting anything. And you have all that time to spend with the director. That's the golden time, really. Shooting is wonderful, but it's like being in a pressure cooker, and you have far fewer options. But in prep, you have the world. I mean, you can ask for it at least. You might not get it, but you can have a conversation about what that world is. And gee, if we had a little more money, maybe we'd do it this way, or we'd use this piece of equipment, or we'd incorporate something else in the process of making the film, prep, you can decide all that when you're a few months out. You can say, God, look at this location. It's a defunct building, but if we did this and this with it, it would cost a little more, but look how much more we could do there, or look how much more we could get out of the value of this place. And because we're 3 months away from shooting, we could actually perhaps do that. Perhaps we could make that happen. I mean, I think all those things become considerations during prep. And I guess for me, when I read a script, it really is about how it moves me. I kind of have to believe those characters. I have to believe the story and understand why they do what they do. It's usually really there in the writing. It's there from the beginning. That's the best situation of all. And when you can have a conversation with the director about that really early on and see what their take on it is, and see if you sync up. I mean, it's a hard process, particularly when you haven't worked with a director before. You have a script to read, you read the script, you do some research, you see what other films they've made, how they did with that, and then you got like an hour and a half to go talk to them. And on the basis of that, decide whether this little marriage is going to work out for the next, 6 months or a year.
Yeah. I can really sense that reading about your process is one thing, but I think watching the films that you've shot is another. Like The Ice Storm in particular is a film I've liked for a very long time. And the way that is like harmonious between where the camera is put and the things going on screen is it just feels like effortless. And I know that is a hard thing to get to. Like that's very special. So I can tell you're really in touch with what's going on.
Yeah, The Ice Storm wasn't effortless. It was a lot of work. And I was lucky to be, in the same city with Ang Lee, at the moment that his opportunity to make The Ice Storm came up, and he had just, I won an award for directing, and I got to share that moment with him. But it was wonderful because he had made a couple of films. I liked the films he had made. We had a really wonderful talk in terms of the interview, and he really took a chance on working with somebody new that he didn't know, and he was already feeling awkward about making a bigger film in the U.S. and dealing with the English language because he wasn't that good at it back then. So he had a lot of fears, and I think that part of what I could do was comfort him and bring him into the sense of a little bigger film in New York City. So I had that sort of positive energy going for me. But I think that what drove me was the fact that here's a really talented filmmaker who's made a couple of films that are each different from the one before. And here's a story that's really well written. It's based on a good book. It's well written, and he's got a lineup of some pretty interesting actors involved. So seems like a fabulous opportunity.
Yeah.
But I mean, the hard part in those situations is you just never know. You never know quite how well you're going to get along with each other. You never know how the rest of the team is going to work. In the case of The Ice Storm, it was wonderful because Ang had chosen Mark Friedberg as a production designer, and Mark's a wonderful artist and designer, very, very talented and a great collaborator. So he and I hit it off. And after all, the designer is pretty much my favorite person on the set because I'm just photographing what they can put in front of the camera. So the three of us, Ang, Mark, and I, really got on well.
Yeah, hearing about the experience with Ang and thinking about all these different directors and how different their styles are, like going from someone like David Lynch and their sensibilities to someone like Jim Jarmusch to someone like Ang Lee, it definitely makes me wonder about how you approach each project and how you lend your sort of sensibilities to each of these very different directors stylistically. And I've heard you say before how you don't like to necessarily think of your cinematography as having a distinct style and that it can be applied to whichever director or story you're working on. And I think just hearing you now describe kind of finding that core in the story and letting the words guide you, I think is really fascinating. And I'd love to hear you just talk about not wanting to apply a style and maybe trying to tailor it to the director's vision.
That makes me think about style. I hope that I don't have a style. I mean, I'd really feel better if I didn't have one that was particularly identifiable, because it seems detrimental somehow. I don't know. I like the idea of being a little elusive and coming up with something different each time. And you do. In preparing a film, you look for things that are right for that story, obviously. But for instance, the notion that maybe for the Ride with the Devil film I did with Ang, that wide screen was a great look, a great thing, because it was about these soldiers in an environment. It was about, some fighting, some battles, and yet there was a real intimacy to the story and the relationships, and often situations where you had two people working very close to each other, and you knew that sense of that framing would really help and give it some power. I think these are all sort of subconscious preferences you have, and then conversations that you have with the director to solidify that. And then as you develop that story and those locations, you realize that, okay, so if we have a frame that is this shape, then these are the things that fit best. These are the things that make the most sense when it comes to building a set, designing an interior, dressing an interior. And it influences color scheme. It influences the costumes. It ripples out throughout the whole production in some way. And that's what preparation is, really.
Makes so much sense. I think there's so many things that come to mind throughout this conversation. And I think this idea that you're essentially aligning your tastes in kind of a profound way. And for you to have your taste from, like you said, from your documentary filmmaking background of composition and of choices that are instinctual and subconscious, and then to have that collaboration with the director and be able to find a middle ground where both of your tastes are creating these worlds that exist independently of one another and are these separate endeavors that take on a life of their own. I think it's just so fascinating. But I'd love to, if you're willing to talk about it a little, we're always interested to hear about the collaboration with the designer. I think that is something that is always very interesting to hear, when the cinematographer is sort of very in sync with the designer on any given project, and what you can speak about in terms of that collaboration throughout so many of these amazing projects.
I think one of the things that appeals to me most about movie making is each movie is a separate job. Each movie is its own thing. And I get to have, a lot of them over the years. So I think I end up probably, in a way, reinventing the wheel each time, because each situation is a little different. So it's another movie with Ang Lee, but it's not in New Canaan, Connecticut in the 70s. It's during the Civil War, in Kansas. We transplant our relationship to a new place and kind of start from scratch and do the research and see what Kansas was like, at the turn of the century. To see what it was like in the years where the Civil War was, and that part of the world. It's all a matter of finding the clues that allow you to make this movie happen, to tell the story best. And it is different each time, and you don't have to use the same stuff, the same colors, the same lights, the same this. You can rethink it, move around. You can try a different film stock. You can try a different camera. You can try different lenses. You can try not moving the camera, when in the last film, maybe you moved it all over the place. You can see what applies. In the case of the ice storm, Ang and I had this thought that during the 70s, there was a school of painting, that was very particular, that caught our eye, that had to do with photorealism, actually, in painting. And we went to galleries. We looked at paintings. We found artists that we liked and said, okay, well, let's just put a picture of that painting and that painting up on the wall and then use those as touchstones. So when I get lost, I just look at some of these pictures that we outlined earlier and say, gee, we had to head back in that direction. It was part of our prep with Mark Friedberg, the designer. And so when we went to New Canaan, Connecticut, we found street corners that not only had the feeling of the 70s still, were very clean and very graphic and lit with hard shadows, and very simple in composition. Those are the things we were looking for, and we found them in New Canaan. We found those spots that helped us create that mood that we thought was right for the 70s for our story to unfold. I mean, things go wrong. The first week of shooting, there was no sun. It was raining most of the time. There were clouds everywhere. Some of those locations don't have this sort of bright sunlight, hard shadows that we wanted, but that's where you make it work. You make it work with what you've got.
I love hearing that. I mean, I think especially hearing the anecdote about having this collaboration with the designer on a scout and when you're scouting on location, I think is so interesting because I feel like it can be really gratifying as a DP to be there with a designer in a space that's not necessarily constructed, that it just exists in the world, and to kind of look at each other and be like, yeah, this is the perfect design for our film when it's really just found. I think that that's a really interesting part of what we do. And
well, I think part of that is what we do is try to make it feel like it was just found, like you just stumbled over this and it was perfect. And in fact, it took 3 weeks to build it, and all those things are fake, and none of those trees are alive, and all of that. I mean, on the ice storm, we were going to shoot the movie in the fall and move into winter, and the story takes place in a very brief time around Thanksgiving, so that would all be appropriate. And then the financing fell through for a moment, and we had to postpone until the spring. So we photographed coming out of winter, and the worst thing that could happen was we would be delayed again, and there would be leaves on all the trees because there was no way to get the leaves off the trees. But for a long time, we painted them brown. And for a long time, we sprayed this kind of hair gel all over them so that it looked like ice. And it was pretty convincing. There's not a lot of visual effects in that movie at all. It really is mostly hair gel and plastic icicles.
I think what also sells it for me, the effects and the ice storms, the sound design along with the images feels like that crystalline.
That's another whole part of what you learn in prep. When you go out, and I took pictures of icicles, a lot of icicles, real icicles. And we were impressed in prep that for whatever reason, natural icicles and certain kinds of backlight are just the most wonderful thing. And man-made icicles don't have it for the most part. We just can't get it right. We can't always make real ice work when we want to. Sometimes it just looks bad. But for Ang and I, the sense of creating that cold, that sense of nature's grip on these poor humans was really what the story was about. It was about people's flaws and how nature was winning, and hence the ice storm and the importance of it, and the importance of that sense of cold without being, blue, without having some Hollywood earmark of what winter should be. And it was very hard for us to find that, to take that color out, to make it very neutral. There's a moment when the train is stuck in the ice and the lights go out. To create the feeling of that shot was really tough. And it got harder and harder as the leaves came out and the dogwoods blossomed. It was really difficult to avoid all that.
Yeah, I am realizing why that film affects me so much on a personal level. And there's some very interesting choices made on a technical level or an aesthetic level that remind me of that feeling you're talking about, of nature being bigger than the humans or them being at the mercy of it. It's so interesting. One shot and transition that is just so special to me is when Christina Ricci and Elijah Wood are kissing in that abandoned pool, and you do that crane up, which then transitions, it cuts and then goes to I think it's a dolly shot in the forest moving past that house. There is something so poetic about those two shots together, the way that they feel small in nature.
Well, it's not by accident. It's really by design. I mean, we found that sort of secret place, that swimming pool, so that we could make a shot that moved up and away from them. I mean, I think that's the only crane day we had on the entire shoot. That's the only opportunity we had to do that. But it was a very special moment to tie the young couple and the adult couple together, and this was the way we wanted to do it, to be able to see them come together in the pool, to kiss, to pull away, and have that sense of drifting away from them, and then going to the adulterous scene where we passed in the woods but not at the house, way far away from the house. And, I remember Ang and I, weeks before, went out into the woods there next to the house and with a viewfinder, just figured out where the dolly track had to be put down so that they'd have time to build it out there in the middle of nowhere to get that shot when the sense of the light was right, because there's no actors, so it was easy to do, but there couldn't be anything around the house, so we had to plan when and how. But it's really by design, and the next shot is, I think, probably on the lovers in bed, and it moves again, so it's by design that series worked together to attempt to evoke this emotion.
This got me thinking a little, just remembering that crane shot and hearing about that. I'm interested to hear about cameras used on the ice storm. I feel like when I looked up some of these films and some of the equipment used, it seemed like there was a tendency to work on RE cameras for the most part. And then from what I saw, the ice storm was Panavision. And I'm curious if that's true and what the choice was for that camera on this and the film and everything. Any memories of that side of things?
I'd have to look at the notes. I don't remember on ice storm specifically. Cameras are really good. They're really good these days. And if we want an image that's slightly less good, there are options. There are lenses you can choose, or there are ways to diffuse or distort the image at your fingertips. Whether it's an Aeroflex camera or a Panavision camera, or there's a couple of other brands out there, it's really not so important. It really is a matter of personal preference. They all work great. But I think in terms of that crane shot, and in general, my preference is to use a small camera that kind of disappears, that's not showy, that's not any bigger than it has to be, because, I don't know, that gets in the way. Everything you put on set somehow distorts and changes the experience that you all go through, including the actors who have to look at all this garbage. The less obtrusive I can be, the more I can, light from outside or have less people in the room or whatever the trick is. I think it makes it easier for everybody.
It seems like you've had experiences working with just really incredible talent throughout your career, and being in the room with Laura Dern and Nicolas Cage and Winona Ryder and, all these incredible artists. I was curious, and I think what you were just describing got to this a little bit, but how do you as a cinematographer relate to and interact with talent on set? And is it something that you consciously think about how you approach that as a means to, like you were saying, maybe fade into the sort of reality of it? Or what's your kind of approach to talent on set?
No, look, everyone who's on set interacts with everyone else. I think that's part of human nature. You need that contact, and actors need it as well. Certain people like more or less of it, but human contact and the sense that you're in a space relating to others who are filmmakers who are going to help you make what you do better is really important. I do believe that the less obtrusive the set environment is, the easier it is for everyone, really. The less people there are around. I remember on this most recent film with Jim Jarmusch that I worked on, we decided, look, less people on set, just get rid of them. Just put them somewhere else, even though it's cold outside. Arranged to make the set clean and free of people who don't absolutely have to be there. It's easier for the performers. It was certainly easier for Jim to concentrate. So why not just try to make that happen? Don't use your cell phone on set. Just take it somewhere else. And I think all of that helps. It's really the actors that suffer most by having people that they don't know in their eye line. There's no excuse for that. You don't need to give them that kind of grief. You can help them make their job a little easier. And it's just, I think, common courtesy, really.
Hi, we are excited to announce our partnership with Laowa Lenses by Venus Optics. Laowa has had a long history of providing cinematographers with unique and state-of-the-art lens options, including their recent Proteus 2x anamorphic series, which remains the most accessible T2.0 option in the market for professional production. A big thank you to SanDisk for helping support our show as well as part of their Relentless Reliability campaign. The Extreme Portable Solid-State Drive has become an essential on film sets and a personal favorite of mine for how durable, reliable, and fast it is. SanDisk leads in drive and memory card technology, emphasizing not just storage, but everything worth keeping. We'd also like to thank our partner at Fujifilm. We're very grateful to them for supporting not just the podcast, but a lot of what we do at the Cinematography Salon. And with the release of their latest camera, GFX 100 II, they release a tool that opens up new creative possibilities. It's brands like these that remind us why we do what we do. It's more than just support. It's about being part of a community that values every shot and every story.
Yeah, so Fred, watching these films that Metrograph's putting on was just incredibly enjoyable. And there was something in all of the films that really struck me. And I started to just kind of notice film after film. And it was just these really sudden and very visceral, like extreme close-ups. And in some films, it was a portrait, it was an insert, but it was just this extremely distinct looking extreme close-up. And the ones that stuck out in my head were sort of Dorothy through the closet in Blue Velvet. It was the close-ups of cigarettes in Wild at Heart. It was this beautiful close-up of Ashima waking up in Queens after her journey from India in The Namesake. And it just, I don't know, started to feel like a noticeable motif. And I just found it to be incredibly beautiful and incredibly story specific and felt like they just came at the right moments and it was beautiful. So I was just interested if, you were talking earlier about the ice storm and how so much of this is designed and so much of this is incredibly intentional. And it makes me wonder if your use of close-ups is in that vein. Is it something that you think about in a very calculated sense? And what do you think is special and unique about capturing characters in that close detail?
I think close-ups are really an important part of seeing, but for me, it's not so much how you get to the close-up, it's when you use the close-up. It's when you choose it. Dramatically how it works best. The close-up of Ashima in The Namesake in the Brooklyn or Queens apartment has meaning because of the moment that you are that close, when you see her despair and not be able to get out of bed for a moment because she's depressed at where she is. It's so different than what she knew and grew up with, that to try to capture that is about where she is and what surrounds her. But mostly it's when you are that close on her face at that moment in the story. I think that's what supports her anguish best. In Wild at Heart, there's a theme of flames and fire that kind of runs through the story. And those close-ups of the match lighting a cigarette, are all in the script and they're all there. David planned it and knew we needed them. How we got them was a little crazy because I learned after trying it a couple times that you couldn't really get these anamorphic lenses to work that close. They just didn't want to do that and get the size close-up that we wanted for the drama of that moment. So it was a real challenge once we started to actually do them until we got the knack of it. So, technically, we had to overcome that. We had to take, we did not have macro lenses. There really wasn't such a thing in the anamorphic world that we had available to us. So it was a matter of using this kind of big clunky zoom lens and zooming all the way into the tight end. And then on top of that, putting several diopters in front of the lens to get that close. And these diopters all caused all sorts of internal flares and distortion of the image, which then become part of the feeling of that match lighting, and that's all coupled with the sound, the surrounding music, the moment in the story, when it happens, come together in a way to make that moment dramatic. Make sense?
It's incredible to hear. It's fascinating. So cool. It makes total sense why they jumped out when they're created with such a specific recipe and in such sort of a, eccentric way. It's very cool.
But it is, it's funny because the process of filmmaking is very much a matter of believing that what you're doing is right. You have to really be committed to this notion, whatever it is, this idea that, yes, this is going to fix our problems. This is going to solve the problem. This is going to make this moment gel and work dramatically. You have to believe that. It's tiring to make a movie. It's a lot of work. Get up at 5:30 in the morning and get through a 12 or 14-hour day. After a few months of that, it's wearing. So you need this thread of an idea that is the story and the things you prepped and talked about with the designer and the director to hold on to. It's like a lifeline. I'm doing this right. I really do know what I'm doing. You have to keep telling yourself this. And when it came to Wild at Heart, making those moments work, those flashes of light from the match as it lit, in slow motion with this kind of orangey flare, we believed that that was it, that was going to be powerful. And I have to say, though it was pretty to watch in dailies, it sort of wasn't magical. But when you see it in the movie, it becomes magical because of the context, because of the moment that he lights the cigarette and it opens a scene, or because of the sound that comes with it is so strong that it becomes a very compelling, dramatic moment.
I guess as a quick follow-up to that, I am curious when I hear you talk about how it's all on the page, and also about how it's really not so much about how it's achieved, but how it's used. I find those both to be really compelling insights, because it's like, especially how it's used and where it's used and the timing of that with the edit. But I guess I'm curious, because we touched briefly earlier on prep and that process, but are there situations where you are suggesting some of these, extreme lengths in these sort of very specific shots? Or in your experience, do you find that really does come usually from the writing or from the director in terms of kind of the shot listing phase of prep?
I think those ideas really come from anywhere. Really, they're not all in the script. Most of them are, but not all of them. Certainly, you think on your feet, you come up with things, you invent things as you go along. You make it different and better because of what you've seen just the day before and how well you've gotten to know this character. And this is a trait that seems to fit, his being nervous with his fingers or whatever the silly issue is. You learn from the experience so far in making this film, and you get ideas. You get these cool ideas that say, oh yeah, I know we talked about prepping it this way, but gee, maybe if we just varied that a little bit and did it a different way, it'd be better. So, I think that you educate yourself. You educate yourself with new ideas as you go. And that's kind of the fun of it, is being there, being alive and real at the moment, to come up with these ideas and to realize that, yes, this one's going to work great and that one not so great. To start to make those decisions. I don't know, in Blue Velvet, we ended up shooting many of the things that are part of the opening scene of the film, like on the last day of photography, for many reasons, but partly because they didn't have actors in them, partly because the producer wasn't sure they really needed to be in the movie and they were pretty low priority. So we did everything else first, but then it came to the picket fence and the flowers, or then it came to the fire truck going by. And it was in the script, it's all written down, yet the way we did it, the way we interpreted it that day, made it what it is, I think. So it's a combination of how these things come together. And really, as filmmakers, you'll learn some of them you're in control of and some of them maybe not so much.
I love hearing you talk about being present.
We try.
Yeah, and I'm curious, because our job can be incredibly stressful and cause a lot of mental anguish at times, or you go in very tired and you're not thinking straight. Are there things that you do to regroup or to maintain a level or try and get yourself back to that present moment if you're not feeling it?
Meditate. Meditation helps.
Yeah.
Take care of yourself. Get as much sleep as you can. I don't know. You really have to bring yourself there every day. Coffee helps, I would say. It's just the reality of it. But one of the things I learned early on, I guess, was on a feature film that's going to go 30 or 60 or 90 days, you really do have to pace yourself. You have to get a sense of what's required for the job and how this relationship with this new director is going to work out and how much energy you can provide and so on. But you have to be pretty realistic about how you're going to maintain being, on location for a long time in a very small city without access to much of anything, away from your family, in bad weather, shooting mostly nights.
Do you want to talk more about meditation? I'm really curious to hear you bring that up.
I didn't mean to make a thing of it. Meditation, look, on Eraserhead, which is where I learned about it, David Lynch really fell in love with meditating and convinced a couple of us on the crew that we might give it a try. And we did. And then we could meditate together. And it all sort of fell into the schedule of the film. So not only were we working together creatively, we were friends and we were meditating at the same time. And that's something that has stayed with me a little on and off over the years, but certainly as a major part of my life that helps get me through it. The film industry is pretty rough. It's hard work. It's a lot of up and down. There's a lot of moments when you're unemployed for perhaps long periods and you don't seem to have much control over it. So stability in your life is an important thing.
Yeah. I recently, my partner has started meditating and I've been joining him, and it seems like such a nice tool to have and to use. And I think I literally have been thinking about next time I'm on set, I'm going to meditate at lunch. Instead of like going to a meeting or whatever, I want to meditate at lunch.
That would be wonderful. Yes, if you can do it, it's a great thing. It's really difficult. Usually I found that somehow the director always manages to get meditation time in, and the rest of us not so much, but that's okay too.
Wow.
No meditation, no food. Keep going.
Right. We'll get you coffee.
Wow.
Right.
That is so fascinating.
So I guess another thing that I've been really interested to talk to you about is just to hear about how all of the technology we use has changed over the course of your career. And as the industry has shifted from film to digital, and lighting units have changed from very like tungsten heavy to a more LED focused package, do you find your own technical choices changing at all? Say like what aperture you find visually appealing on shooting film versus digital, or even the quality of light that you prefer? Is that something you want to speak about at all?
Sure. Yeah, that's a big subject. Kind of the hardest thing is not becoming hung up on the technology that we're using. And I see and I love the changes that have happened. Look, film is great. Film is wonderful. It's very hard to shoot film these days. It costs more. It's a little more cumbersome for production. Sometimes it's possible to convince the powers that be that it's going to work for you and that it's worth the effort. And sometimes it's not. And in the same sentence, I have to say that you can do wonderful things with all the new tools we have. Digital cameras are quite wonderful. In the first few years, they were pretty clunky. We were all trying to overcome the deficiency of digital cameras because they didn't look anything like film, and we really wanted them to look like film. Now we have developed cameras and pushed the technology and the tools around to the point where you can imitate film pretty closely if you choose to. You don't have to. You can do it a different way. You have much more at your disposal. And in fact, most every one of those films that are shot on film, movies that are shot on film, have been manipulated digitally to be enhanced to some degree, to be changed, to be altered, to take film and take the next step, which is a wonderful tool as well. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do that. But this goes to the cameras. I mean, each camera has its different characteristics, the way it records color, it treats contrast, all those things are part of the deal. And as a cinematographer, yeah, I need to know that. I need to know all about it. That's important to me because I need to know the capability of what I'm working with and what the newest, latest advance gets me or costs me. The same with lighting. You know, LED lights are wonderful. I mean, they do things, some things much better. The color range and the fact that it's all controllable from your phone is a wonderful thing. There's some things they don't do. They're not as powerful yet. They're not as hard and harsh and toasty, if that's what you're looking for. So you've got to choose the tool that's right for the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing I was thinking about behind that question too is, you know, I think maybe this was like a Roger Deakins thing. I can't remember at this point, but him saying shooting on film, we used to shoot exteriors at like a T8 or something, you know, and I feel like now it's more common to shoot things more wide open to.
But again, you know, the aperture of the lens is something that controls the image to a great degree. It controls the amount of depth of field you have, you know, which is a realistic thing in terms of how much is in focus, how much is not. It determines the way things go out of focus, the way flares happen or don't happen with whatever brand or vintage of lens you're using. So all those things are part of the deal. I don't know. I was never enthused with everything being in focus. So I tried not to close the aperture very much. I liked the sense of the lenses that I used to be more specific in focus with the rest going out of focus. I liked that as a tool where everything wasn't in focus, everything therefore wasn't as distracting in the background, that I could focus where I wanted it. I could put it on a person or one person and not the other and have that control. That really appeals to me, and you get that by using somehow less light and or more open lens and or diffusion on the camera. All those things work sort of in concert in an interesting way. But you get to choose. You get to choose what lens you use, how old it is, and you get to choose that aperture. And, I found that some of those flares, some of those defects in lenses are kind of interesting. So maybe opening the aperture is okay. You just got to know what the consequences are. And the other thing that Roger Deakins has said about technology, which is wonderful, is the fact that with film dailies, you often didn't sleep at night. There's always that issue of that doubt of whether I really got it right, whether I got the exposure right. Because, they walk in the door, it's very bright outside, and they walk in the door and it's very, very dark inside. And maybe it's going to be too dark and you're actually not going to see in that close-up exactly what the director wants to see. You're going to miss something, and you really won't know until the next day with a film lab. And that's tiresome. That's boring. That creates anxiety. And in the digital world, you maybe sleep a little better at night.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah. It does bring up a question that I had, which was, I'm curious, you had mentioned previously that you have a print of a film for this upcoming Metrograph screening. And I guess now hearing some of this philosophy on technical, it makes me wonder, do you feel like there's anything that you've just described, some things that we've gained, from digital in terms of lessening the anxiety and sort of knowing what you have in real time. But can you think of any things that, in your opinion, that we've lost from this more analog pipeline and your experiences developing your skill for exposing film, color timing film, being able to really have the print and have ownership of a print? Is there anything with these technological advancements and the changes that you can think of that maybe we've lost a little bit? I just watch these films and they feel so robust and they feel so hardy. And yeah, it just makes me wonder, if you can think of anything in that realm.
That's, hard. I think that for me, there's nothing quite like seeing a film projected, at 24 frames a second. There's a sort of a sense about the way the image flickers and the way the grain moves on the screen that's completely unique and can't be replaced quite yet by digital media. It's getting better at creating that sense of grain. I do like that sense of grain. I mean, partly because I grew up with it and that's what I know best. And I think digital media is getting better at making that feeling present in a movie if you want it. You don't have to have it. But for me, that's part of a movie that makes it this illusion that works in the sense that, if it was completely seamless and without any grain, or if it didn't appear to flicker, it would be more realistic. I don't quite understand that argument. I don't quite get it. I feel that it's all fiction that we're making, and the way film does it is pretty convincing, and I do like it. I like it a great deal. In the same way that making a movie in black and white has a different feeling about it. It's not trying to replicate reality in the most real sense. It's kind of a generation removed. I mean, in that way, remember film is too. We're all making this fictional story with these tools and creating something that's going to entertain and hopefully move people.
I also get the sense that when you mention the limitations of latitude of a character walking from a bright exterior to a dark interior, it's those skills developed with older film stocks that had less latitude and less room for error, and then becoming so familiar with that pipeline of color timing and using different ways to process film to create different looks. All of that, I imagine, contributes to one's ability to make the digital image look more filmic or just to be a better cinematographer, essentially. And it's just interesting to hear from people about how some of those skills sort of carry through, of course.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. And I mean, certainly my generation of filmmakers grew up with film and have spent a lot of energy trying to make digital media look like film because that was comfortable and familiar and we knew how to control it. And now there's a generation of filmmakers who've grown up totally with digital, and let's see what they do with it. I mean, there's lots of room to move in all sorts of different new directions. So why not take advantage of it and try things out? I mean, that's how you break ground, is by going back and using sort of an academy aperture, changing the shape of the frame, maybe making it square, try something new because it's easier to do now. Maybe it fits this story a little better for some.
So Fred, I feel like we are obligated to talk about your skill for doing car work because it is just honestly totally remarkable. And watching these films, it's just across all of them, there's just beautiful examples. And the ones that jumped out were, Blue Velvet, Wild at Heart, The Ice Storm, Night on Earth. And for people unfamiliar, Night on Earth is a Jim Jarmusch film, and it's set in 5 different cities, all inside a moving taxi cab at nighttime. And I just love to hear whatever anecdotes you'd like to share about the experience of lighting and shooting Night on Earth. I heard a little bit about engines being removed from cars to fit you in the camera, shooting in negative 20-degree temperatures, whatever you want to share about the lighting techniques on that. I think to me, it just felt incredibly, like Ava said earlier, effortless, but of course it wasn't at all. So I'd love to hear about it.
Shooting in cars is kind of a necessary evil in filmmaking. Writers like to write scenes in cars in all sorts of weird locations. And it's great, and dramatically it's fitting because strange things do happen in cars, for sure. When you have two people speaking to each other, but they actually are never looking at each other. They're both looking out the windows. They're both, one's driving and the other's doing something else. They're not looking at each other, but they're having a conversation. It's a strange feeling, or they're from the front seat to the back seat. It's never easy. It's never easy to shoot in a car. Whether it's moving or standing still, it's a headache. But it's something that we put up with. And over the years, I know I've tried to solve these problems many different ways. On Night on Earth with Jim Jarmusch, he came to me and said, I have this idea for a film. It's 5 short stories, all takes place in cabs. And it's going to be really simple because I have the actors right where I want them. They can't move. They're sitting down and they're not going anywhere. So I can control everything that happens. And of course, he hadn't really shot in cars until that point. But we learned a lot of things, certainly when we got to the first city, which was Helsinki, about how to shoot 4 grown men who were smokers in a car with closed windows at 25 degrees outside. It posed all sorts of difficulties. Jim's idea was it has to be real. It has to have that sense of reality that we'll get by driving around each of these cities. And we did. I think that there's many, falls into the category of kind of happy accidents, things that happened around or in the car that we really couldn't necessarily control, but really worked for us in terms of the look and the feeling of the scene and making the drama work. But for Night on Earth, because we were traveling to different cities and because the core crew was really just several people, we had to take some of this small lighting equipment with us. So I had devised, with my gaffer, Mike Katz, we devised a way to put colored lights on the roof of each of these cabs and bounce the light into the side windows and imitate moving through a city. So it was the lighting for the interior of the cars that I had some control over. We would drive around each city in a loop, so we knew what the background was. We knew what the street lights were doing and what we were going to see out the back window. But the light on their faces was really important, and that was a way I could help Jim differentiate one city from the next, to build a color palette, a kind of a way of seeing each city just slightly differently, because I could control the color. I could control how light or dark it was, kind of on the fly as we were shooting. Of course, the way this worked was the lights were on top of the car, the gaffer in the grip and the sound recordist were in the warm camera car with the director, and I was strapped to the outside of the the vehicle, operating the camera, and, just making sure that it all looked right through the viewfinder, because in those days, video taps were very, very poor. The image quality was terrible, and there were no guarantees unless somebody was looking through the camera.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, I'm trying to imagine what this rigging looks like. Were you on a process trailer, or was it something different?
No, we couldn't afford a process trailer. So this was some sort of service vehicle, a pickup truck or a covered wagon of some sort, or in 1 or 2 cities, we had a proper camera car that had a generator and all that stuff on it. For the most part, it was pretty makeshift. They were up there in the van, towing us in the car behind them. And occasionally things would go wrong. I mean, when you do car work, it's important to find usually the smoothest road you can. And that's just not always possible, particularly in New York City of all places. The bumps, the vibration of the camera, the vibration of things clunking in the car that makes the sound unusable, all those things are working against you on a real car shoot. In addition to the weather, I mean, when it rains and you're outside and you suddenly can't shoot, or it doesn't match because of the windshield wipers or the water on the windshield, this all plays into the drama of trying to get the night's work done.
Yeah, so then not having a process trailer made it so that you had to find a solution that put you in the hood.
Right. So generally what we did was we would buy a car, take the engine out, put me in there, and just allow me to shoot through the front windshield of whatever shot we needed with the lighting that was working on the roof of the car. But it was the whole rig had to be towed around the city, and there was no choice about that. Jim really wanted this sense of reality of being in the city, and it led to all sorts of, I would say, other adventures and stories. When we were in Rome, we had planned a loop that was 3.5 minutes of around these blocks. We could control traffic and the backgrounds would all look correct. And Jim and Roberto Benigni, the actor in the piece, had worked out some of the dialogue, but Jim allowed Roberto to change it a little bit on the fly. And we would go around the loop and Jim would say, God, Roberto, that was great. That take was fabulous. We'll use that. We're going to do it one more time. Just, you got to cut some stuff out of it. You got to make it shorter so it fits. And Roberto would say, okay. So we would go around again. And of course, the dialogue would just get longer. And we'd have to go around several times in order to fit the dialogue in. And Jim would say, no, you got to make it quicker. All these things happened on the fly while driving around these cities, whatever the temperature or the weather was,
Yeah. So then, yeah, I love, Roberto Benigni's part is so funny in this. And I'm wondering, sorry to get really nitty gritty about this, but were the lights kind of like spider legs hanging off the car?
So the lights are all on a roof rack. There's 12 or 15 lights, small lights with colored gels on them, all attached to a roof rack that we could put on any of these cars. The lights were shining off toward the roadway, and we had put boards, bouncing white or aluminum boards along the sides of the car. So the light hit the board, bounced in, created soft light, and we had worked a program so that the gaffer could fade up and fade down lights one after the other on a small dimmer board wherever we went. And he would be able to adjust the movement of the lights as well as the color. So they were not LED lights. This was the old days of gels attached to each light to determine the color. And it was really up to him. And I had a walkie-talkie. I could speak to him about what was going right or going wrong. But it was a little fly-by-night. Kind of each city was a little different depending on how we could rig it or what was required for that city. But it seemed to work. One of the frustrating things I will say is that we had made a decision early on that the only way to get consistency in the look of the film and to have control over it was to do all the dailies at Duart in New York. So we were in Helsinki. It meant shipping the film back to New York for processing. So dailies were a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 day process, depending on whether there was a weekend in between. We never really knew exactly what we were getting. It was kind of a surprise, dailies.
Yeah.
And fortunately, most of the time, it worked out, but it wasn't always easy.
That's so interesting. Yeah, my experience of watching the movie was like, the lighting looks like random street and industrial light coming into the car. And I was like, but how is it always so good?
Yeah.
I was like, what are they doing?
Well, we succeeded on some level.
Yeah.
It's always difficult. It's the physicality of working in cars is a tough thing, and having a car drive through existing lighting is something else that we do occasionally, or find a street that is well lit where the street lights actually reach into the car and can light faces, or find a way to attach lights to the car or light from a trailer outside the car, or all these things. We've tried everything. We're very good at adopting techniques to make this trick work. And the other thing that we do, of course, simultaneously is do this in a studio. So do this with the car standing still and try to create the illusion of motion, the illusion that you're traveling against a green screen. So in that case, the actors never get to see quite where they're driving. I know where it is because we've shot the background plates that are going to go in there, and we know what the road looks like, and I can light it with moving lights or whatever appropriately. But green screens are not so much fun, really, because it's kind of a boring technique to use. Today, it's easier to put those background plates on LED screens and create a volume and do it, with newer, more modern technology, which works really well because it's all interactive. It all happens. All the reflections in the car are correct. And the actor can look outside the window and actually see what the roadway or the neighborhood looks like. So it's a big advance. It's a wonderful thing. It's very expensive, unfortunately, but generally worth the time and effort because you can do it so much faster.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think when I see Night on Earth, I'm just like, there is no way to create that level of grit and authenticity that you feel with the camera mounted to the car and it really rumbling around the city. But hearing you talk about it, I can't imagine the benefit of the volume for so many reasons, including maybe not having the operator literally strapped to the outside of a car and things like that. But I'm curious, you have talked about getting to use the volume for car work. And what was it like, really? I mean, having so much experience doing it analog, and then I'm sure over time doing it with programmable LED lighting, and then eventually with an LED volume, it's like, that is a great example of a pretty incredible technological advancement and transition.
It's like going from the Stone Ages, yes.
I'm curious to hear what your reaction to was working with that.
I mean, I think that the whole thing about car photography is really, we're making it up. We're creating an illusion that people are really moving down a street that is of our design, the place that's appropriate for the story, where we want them to be at the speed we want them to be. But in fact, you're making it up for the camera. You're creating this sense of motion, whether it's on a green screen and you're standing still, or in an LED volume where you can actually see things move, and some of that light is actually wrapping around the actors and moving as well. I think for me, it all informs that notion that we're trying to make it real. So whether I'm working with LED lights that are very expensive on a volume situation, or I'm winging it because this is just 2 lines of dialogue and we can do it in one shot. So it's really worth toughing it out and lighting one block of the city that's just long enough to shoot that piece of dialogue and doing it for real with the 2 actors we have, at night during production. So you really get to decide what it is. They all inform each other because you're just trying to make this illusion work.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah. I had another question about car work. That's another seemingly unorthodox approach that you took to something. Again, because reading about these or listening to them in other capacities, really opened my mind up to what you can do, thinking outside the box. It's so fun to hear about some of these solutions that you came up with.
That's a simple solution.
Don't write car scenes. So in the Ice Storm, on the bonus features on the Blu-ray, which I do own, you spoke about creating a transparent box for a car scene that you shot. That was, I think the transparent box was in front of the windshield. Can you explain like what you're trying to achieve, like aesthetically or technically with that setup?
Oh, that's a stretch. On the ice storm, we had a scene between Kevin Kline and Tobey Maguire in the beginning of the story, and I'm really not certain I knew what I was doing when I designed this idea of actually taking the windshield out of the car and towing it around town for them to do the dialogue. But because you couldn't accept the wind blowing in the window, I built this sort of plexiglass box around the front of the car. So the camera was actually inside the box, and we were all in the camera car towing it. Nobody was actually operating, as I recall, but it was all locked off. But I had created this box with different kinds of diffusion on it so that when the sun hit it from certain angles, they'd be softly lit. It's a very softly lit scene without kind of harsh sunlight anywhere. Because of the design of the car, I didn't want, the windshield was really sloped back, and I didn't want the sun to reach in too far. So I came up with this idea about the box around the front of the car. I mean, it kind of works. It wasn't exactly the way I wanted it to look, but it seemed to fit the bill, that day we were shooting it.
So the idea was to take the sunlight and bounce it into the car instead of doing direct light?
Right. The idea was to let the sunlight hit the diffusion, and that would glow into the car. So it was a much softer way of creating this light. It was less harsh in my mind, at least. It was slightly out of control in practice, but with some minor modifications, we got it to work okay.
Is that something that you would do again?
Probably not.
Is there any benefit to it?
Well, it was very soft. It was very becoming light. It took a while to rig, which was a drag. I think I'd find other ways to solve that problem nowadays.
Yeah.
Super interesting.
So earlier in the interview, you made a comment that I thought was really interesting. You said, "What is beauty?" And I loved that question. It also felt like a statement. And I completely agree with you on beauty being completely subjective. My personal philosophy is like, there are films like Harmony Korine makes, like a Julian Donkey Boy or a Trash Humpers, where they are like anti-aesthetics. And there's tons of beauty in that. Where cinematography sits right now, at least culturally, what it feels like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what it feels like is that we, I think as a craft, are also incentivized to make things pretty. Pretty as I know that's a hard thing to describe, but on Instagram, I would say that I know.
No, it's true. It's completely true.
Yeah.
Our standards have changed. Our standards of what is acceptable, what's desirable in terms of not only what is portrayed, but how it's portrayed. The photograph as well as the object or the subject of it, has to fit certain sort of unwritten rules of what an Instagram post should be, this post or that post. It's kind of accelerated that sort of notion of, or competition of trying to outdo someone else by making a photograph that's flashy or more unique. We reach much harder and much faster to do these things. And I think it's fine. It is what we do. It is a product of that new technology and having it all at our fingertips so easily. I'm not completely sure what it gets us, but it's certainly interesting. I think that truly, when it comes to creating a piece that's 90 minutes long, that's to be genuine and heartfelt, it has to be based on more than flash. More than what's current and acceptable or desirable today. That if it's going to last, if it's going to be consistent within the space of that film, that story, for instance, it has to have better roots than what's currently popular. And I think that's where the director's desire, the director's vision for a story shared with the designer and the cinematographer and the composer all play into what you make, what this illusion is. The way you're telling this tall tale, it really comes down to genuineness, I think. and honesty on some level. You can make things that are entertaining that aren't genuine, but I think it all works better if your heart is in it. I think that the way it's told, whether it's very, very smooth and seamless or whether it's rough and jagged, becomes part of that whole feeling, that emotion. And, it becomes obviously part of the conversation when you put this whole thing together, when you plan it out. Is it going to be like Harmony Korine or like I don't know, John Cassavetes, or is it going to be much, much more polished and seamless in its approach? Both are fine. Both work great. But I think they work because of the dedication of the filmmaker and the thought behind it, because of the consistency that they've chosen as an approach for the movie. And I think that's kind of the great fun of it, is finding those ways to look at a story and to make it unique. I mean, there's certainly no right or wrong to this, and if you look at people who tell stories pretty convincingly, there's lots of right ways to do it. And there's ways to do it with both more and less consistent style within the piece. It is a matter of the filmmaker's dedication to the process and to their talent in seeing the end and, a certain amount of luck.
Yeah, and I think what hurts me is that I love filmmaking. Like, I started out being a film nerd before I really cared about cinematography. As a cinematographer, I almost feel like the financial incentive to make things look pretty or to get more likes, like, it brings in more work. To get likes or to get more attention brings in work, which allows you to keep working as a cinematographer to pay rent, and it, to me, what the dance or the struggle has been is to allow myself to be because the financial incentives makes me feel like that a less manicured approach is wrong because there's less financial incentive to it, perhaps on the front side of things, So I think that, I don't know if there's a question about this, but it's more just I love that you brought that up because it's so important to remember that.
I think it speaks to keeping your overhead low. But I mean, what if you could be more like John Cassavetes was? John Cassavetes, who made the films that he made, that he was very, very happy with, that were very honest and true pieces of storytelling that were financed by a pretty successful acting career. And I'm not saying that his acting wasn't honest, but I'm saying that he acted and made the money doing that, the money that he didn't make on the revenue from his films. I mean, each film he made was based on the little bit of income from the former one and mortgaging his house again. That's what he did. He acted in order to support his film career. And on some level, I think that's something that we all do. I have been able to shoot commercials for television for that process successfully for years and years, and it's allowed me to make choices about what movies I can make. I have tended away from films that were broadly successful. This is a horrible thing to say about myself, but had some quality that I liked about them, and were with people, with filmmakers that I admire and appreciate, and ones that I felt I could build a relationship with. These are the things that I've pursued, and I've excluded some bigger films, sure. And I mean, Hulk was a pretty big film. We had a great time making it, Ang Lee and I. So it's not an exclusive contract, but yes, my desire to make a project that costs less because there will be a little less oversight, and I think we can tell this story with the resources we have, is more desirable for me. It's more comfortable for me because part of the way I support myself is by shooting television commercials, and that's something I feel good about. I enjoy doing it. Some filmmakers don't. That's fine too.
Yeah, I love that. I think just really interesting earlier here, you describe it as does it have roots? And I think that's such a beautiful way to assess whether something can have a lasting impact and not be sort of just pretty or glossy, but if it really has roots, I think it's just a really
but you can
way.
never be the judge of, I mean, who knows?
Mm-hmm.
It's like saying, it's one thing to say this movie is successful now, and another to say, what's it going to look like 10 years from now or 15 years from now? Is it going to hold up at all as storytelling? Is anyone going to watch it or need to watch it again? Maybe not, but you can't predict that ever. It depends on so many things.
So Fred, I think this has just been a remarkable conversation.
Well, I hope it makes sense. I don't have any perspective on it.
We wanted to close with a question about mentorship because it's such a core tenet of this project, of the Cinematography Salon. And, as someone who is a board member of the ASC and who's someone who has championed diversity and made space for mentorship through the ASC, and as a professor at NYU Tish's graduate school, just seems like you play a very significant role in sort of shaping the direction that this industry goes into to an extent. And I'd love to hear you share any thoughts or insights on the importance of education and maybe how mentorship and education has influenced you in your career and your path, and maybe how you see mentorship helping and supporting the next generation.
I mean, mentorship is a wonderful thing. It really allows us to pass knowledge on to the next folks who are going to make movies. Those people who helped me along the way really stay in my mind as teachers in the sort of very biggest sense of the word, not just teachers about the technology of filmmaking, for instance, at film school, at grad school, but teachers about having something to say when you make a movie, the importance of that, of the kind of stories that you decide to tell, the way you decide to tell them is part of the deal because of the commitment you need to do it right, I think. I mean, Beta Botka was a Czech cinematographer who I was an assistant for at graduate school at NYU. And he, impressed upon me these sort of basics of filmmaking and the process and how it worked, not just tons and tons of technical knowledge and laboratories and optics and so on. It was much more than that. It was the roots of why you're telling this story, why this one is important to you, the importance of all that stuff that I must say, I'd never really thought about as a young filmmaker. It's those people that open my eyes to the process, whether they're an educator or a working professional. It's cool. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And it's something that I've tried to help with and embody and teach at Tisch at NYU and bring as much of that forward as I can. I think that, look, there's many hundreds of young, very, very talented filmmakers who are taking over, who are just going to do so much better job of this than we did, that you just give them as much support and praise as you can and shove them out the door and tell them to go make movies.
What a beautiful place to end. And seriously, thank you, Fred, for your time today. I think getting the chance to talk to you and do a longer interview is really an honor. Just very grateful for all the incredible work you've made and all the time you've given us today. So thank you.
Well, thanks. It's good to have met you both.
This episode of the Cinematography Salon podcast was produced by Peter Pascucci, Ava Benjamin Shore, and David Kruta, with original music by One Wave and edited by Corey Abel. We created this episode in partnership with the Cinematography Salon, and we would like to extend a special thanks to the Salon community for supporting our efforts with this show. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to Able Cine for their continued support. If you're unfamiliar with their offerings, Able Cine provides services such as equipment rentals, sales, maintenance, training, and much more. Additionally, they host complimentary events at their various locations. For more details, please visit ablecine.com. If you enjoyed listening to the show, we encourage you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media to stay up to date with our latest episodes and news. Thanks.